Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing big summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
You know, usually when we talk about diagnosing a problem, there's this expectation of like mechanical precision.
Right.
Like an X-ray.
Exactly. If you're a doctor looking at a broken arm, the fracture is just right there. It's a jagged white line on the film, and you just point to it and say, there's the problem.
Yeah, it's very contained. It implies a really clear linear solution, you know? Put a cast on it, wait 6 weeks, and you're done.
Right. Which is deeply comforting. But the second you step out of a clinic into like the actual world of systemic urban poverty, that X-ray machine just completely shatters.
Oh, absolutely.
You aren't looking at a clean fracture anymore. You're trying to diagnose an entire society.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters because when you're dealing with real destitution, you aren't just looking at a lack of money. You're dealing with this crazy complex web of public health, addiction, urban geography, and deeply entrenched psychological trauma.
And that complex web is exactly what we are navigating today. So we're doing a deep dive into this remarkable piece of source material. It's called The Heart of the City, the first 125 years of the Sydney City Mission by June Owen.
It is such a fascinating read.
It really is. And if you're listening and thinking, a 19th century religious charity was just some quiet people standing on a clean street corner handing out Bibles.
Yeah, you need to completely erase that image.
Completely. Picture instead a desperate missionary literally stepping over an open raw sewage trench to spoon-feed gruel to a starving baby, while right next door, violent gang members are placing bets on a dead guy in a pub.
It is visceral. It's gritty.
It's shocking, honestly. It tracks how this very rigid, highly ideological organization was absolutely forced by the streets to morph from just, tract-handing evangelists into a massive modern social welfare agency.
And at the very center of that 125-year history is this defining ideological struggle. It's this battle of providing Bibles versus bread.
Yes.
And as we trace this evolution, it asks a profound question that is, deeply relevant to you today, whether you run a nonprofit or a business. Like, how does an institution survive for over a century when the whole world radically changes around it?
Right.
And the answer here is striking. An organization survives by painfully dismantling its own methods while fiercely protecting its core mission.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand the scale of this pivot, we have to travel back to the starting line. We can't use a modern lens.
No, you have to look at the sociology of the era.
Exactly. So we're going to Sydney, Australia in the 1860s, and the sources paint this picture of a city with whiplash-inducing economic contrast.
Right, massive wealth right next to extreme poverty.
Yeah. On one hand, you've got gold flowing in from the regional mines. There's new railways, a brand new state parliament building. Merchants are just flush with cash.
It was rapid economic acceleration, but then literally just a few streets away from those big sandstone banks, you have a completely different universe.
It's the dark underbelly.
Exactly. You've got a city still wrestling with its convict past. I mean, the whipping block and the public stocks had only recently been removed from downtown.
Wow.
Yeah. And the poorer areas, especially the dockside district known as the Rocks, they were just descending into unregulated squalor.
And the physical reality of that squalor is, it's hard to wrap your head around today. We're talking about areas controlled by violent larrikin gangs.
The pushes, historically.
Right, the pushes.
Yeah.
And there were over 90 opium dens operating openly. 90.
In a city that hadn't even hit 100,000 people yet.
Which is insane.
Well, to understand how 90 opium dens survive, you have to understand the misery they were medicating, right? The housing was thrown together by landlords with zero regard for municipal planning.
No sanitation at all.
None. The text gives this staggering example. A cluster of 27 houses that shared a total of 3 toilets and 3 communal water taps.
27 households relying on 3 taps. I can't even visualize the logistics of that. The public health nightmare is inevitable.
People were walking across wooden planks laid over open sewer trenches just to get to their front doors.
And the statistics from the book back up the horror perfectly. The infant mortality rate in Sydney was 165.5 deaths per 1,000 births.
Compared to 92 in the rural areas.
Yeah. In some specific slums, 30 out of every 100 kids died before their first birthday.
Just preventable death everywhere.
So into this hyperlethal environment steps a man named Benjamin Short.
Benjamin Short is such a fascinating catalyst. He arrives in Sydney in 1860 from London. And he's not a clergyman.
Right.
He's an incredibly successful life insurance canvasser for the AMP Society. So he's a salesman at his core. He understands persuasion.
But he's also this devout evangelical Christian, right? He'd seen the London City Mission back in England. But I'm stuck on something here. If he's this brilliant practical businessman calculating actuarial tables, how does he approach the crushing poverty of the rocks?
Well, he completely blends his corporate salesmanship with his theology.
Yeah, the book says he would rent halls and give public lectures called Happy Homes and How to Make Them.
I love that title.
Right. And in the first half, he's literally pitching life insurance policies to working men to save their widows from destitution. And then in the exact same breath, he pivots to preaching the gospel to save their eternal souls.
Because to the 19th century Protestant mind, those two things were mechanically linked.
Yeah.
Selling a man life insurance protects his physical future, and preaching protects his eternal future. He saw absolutely no division.
But then he hits a wall, right? The mathematical reality of the slums.
Exactly. As he went deeper into the rocks, the people he met were so deeply impoverished they couldn't afford the weekly premiums on even his cheapest policies.
So the market mechanism completely fails.
It fails. So in 1862, driven to save these people, he calls a public meeting. He gathers wealthy merchants, Protestant leaders, politicians, and they officially form the Sydney City Mission, the SCM.
Now, if you are listening to this today, you'd assume the next step is obvious. You get a board of wealthy politicians, they pool their capital, they build a soup kitchen, right?
Fund an orphanage, build a clinic.
But they do none of that.
Yeah.
Zero. And to understand why, we have to look at the psychology of that specific committee.
Yeah.
It was an incredibly harsh philosophical framework.
It really was. You have to understand 19th century theology to get this. They didn't view poverty as a systemic failure.
No macroeconomics.
None. They viewed poverty strictly as the direct result of individual sin. The logic was, God rewards the righteous. If you live a pious, sober life, you will prosper.
So if you're destitute, living next to an open sewer, it's just undeniable proof that you're living a sinful life.
Precisely. It is the ultimate victim-blaming ideology codified into religious doctrine. They believed giving out food or capital would just subsidize the sin.
So their solution was strictly morality.
The boardroom consensus was that the only way to fix the slums was to awaken each resident to Christ. Save the soul, the drinking stops, the guy works harder, and the poverty vanishes.
So because of that ideology, the SCM's founding mandate was purely to evangelize. Relief giving, like handing out a blanket or a piece of bread, was explicitly forbidden.
Forbidden by rule.
They hired these first missionaries and basically said, go into the slums, read the Bible, and hand out religious tracts. And I want to pause on that word tracts, because today we think of a gentle, inspirational pamphlet.
Oh, no. 19th century religious tracts were aggressive.
They were terrifying, just mass-produced warnings about hellfire. So this wealthy committee is essentially viewing the gospel as a software patch. Deploy the missionaries, install the patch in the minds of the poor, and the hardware bugs of society will just resolve themselves.
But theories formulated in comfortable boardrooms rarely survive first contact with the front lines.
Never.
And the front lines of Sydney in the 1860s were brutal. This is the defining ideological clash of the early SCM. The battle on the streets, Bibles versus bread.
Right. So the committee hires dedicated people like Stephen Robbins and Mrs. Sarah Aspinall. And the rule book they get is incredibly rigid.
They had to spend exactly 30 hours a week doing house visits.
They had to read a specific scripture at every home. They couldn't talk politics. They had to prudently reprove swearing. And my favorite, or least favorite, the bizarre health warnings.
So the manual.
Yeah. It explicitly ordered them, do not swallow your saliva while visiting the sick. Like, that's going to stop airborne diseases in a tenement.
They were sent into an epidemiological combat zone with paper pamphlets. But these agents were actually on the ground. They were smelling the sewage. They were looking into the sunken eyes of starving people.
And within days, they realized a fundamental physiological truth. You cannot preach to a starving person. A person freezing to death doesn't care about a tract warning them about hell. They're already in it.
What's fascinating here is how the visceral reality of that suffering forced these workers into immediate insubordination.
They had to break the rules.
They were in a terrible ethical bind. They knew these families needed calories, but the committee allocated zero funds for relief. So the missionaries, who were paid working-class wages themselves, just quietly started dipping into their own pockets.
They used their own rent money
to buy bread, firewood, medicine.
The journals of these missionaries in the book are just devastating. There's a report from Stephen Robbins. He walks into a tenement, finds an elderly couple who had eaten only one single meal a day for 6 straight weeks.
6 weeks.
And the landlord is at the door threatening to seize their furniture. Robbins didn't pull out a tract. He immediately gave them a shilling of his own money and then spent the rest of his day walking around the city begging his personal friends to scrape together another 2 shillings and 6 pence to keep them off the street.
And we have to remember the economics there. A shilling in the 1860s was significant money for a poorly paid missionary.
Huge personal sacrifice.
And it was physical labor, too. Another missionary found a recent immigrant mother and infant starving in a freezing loft. He didn't leave a Bible. He went down to the street, used his own money to buy coal, carried it up, built a fire, stuffed newspapers in the broken windows to block the wind.
Wow.
Yeah. He ran to a friend's house to beg for oatmeal, cooked the gruel, and meticulously spoon-fed the mother and child because they were too weak to lift their arms.
And then there's a legendary Michael Bowmaker. He's doing visits off Kent Street and finds a child near death, weakly trying to bite into a rock-hard, stale crust of bread. Bowmaker drops his satchel, wraps the kid in his own coat, runs into the street, flags down a passing commercial milkman, begs for a jug of milk, and hand-feeds the child.
Literally pulling it back from the brink of starvation.
And the bitter irony, the missionaries sometimes had to pay for the religious tracts themselves out of their own wages.
It just perfectly illustrates the absolute disconnect between the boardroom and the alleys. They were running a rogue social welfare agency subsidized by their own poverty.
Well, the committee fiercely resisted it. Like in 1875, 13 years after the mission was founded, the board is still debating if missionaries should even be allowed to relieve the destitute. How could they debate that after 13 years of evidence?
Because of the fear of the Rice Christian. The committee was terrified that if they gave out food, destitute people would just fake a religious conversion to get a free meal.
So it would ruin their spiritual statistics.
Exactly. But the reality on the streets was undeniable. It took decades, but by the 1890s, the dispensing of soup and coal was finally validated by the church hierarchy as a legitimate Christ-like duty.
But it makes you ask, how did these frontline workers survive doing this grueling work for decades with zero institutional support for the physical charity? They were fighting a two-front war against the slums and their own management.
Which leads us into the incredible hardships they faced and just how paranoid and out of touch that committee actually was.
Let's talk about the physical danger first. They were walking into hyper-violent areas where even armed colonial police refused to go alone.
Like Duran's Alley.
Yeah, Nathaniel Pidgeon, this pioneer missionary, an Irish cabinet maker, used to preach there. And there's a documented account of pub patrons in that alley placing bets on whether a guy who collapsed at the bar was dead or just passed out, while they kept drinking around his body.
And Pidgeon routinely had rocks and garbage thrown at him while he tried to speak.
And beyond the gang violence, there's the disease. During the bubonic plague epidemic at the turn of the century, the missionaries never stopped their daily visits.
No, they didn't retreat.
And the cost was absolute. Missionary J.H. Mills lost his eldest son to the plague, a direct casualty of his father's commitment.
They risked their lives daily. And did the committee offer hazard pay, medical support?
Nope. Just bizarre bureaucratic restrictions.
Driven by institutional paranoia. You have to look at the economics of the 19th century church. The committee was filled with local clergymen from traditional Protestant denominations.
Yeah.
And those churches relied heavily on pew rents. Wealthy parishioners paid a subscription fee to reserve a specific seat.
So the church's operating budget was tied directly to maintaining a wealthy congregation. Which means, here's where it gets really interesting, the local clergy were terrified that these dynamic street preachers were going to poach their paying customers.
They viewed them as economic competitors. In 1876, a prominent clergyman, Canon Stephen, actually files a formal complaint. His grievance. A missionary holding street meetings was attracting well-to-do people to stop and listen.
It's unbelievable. He essentially extorted the committee. He said, if you don't stop respectable people from listening to your street preachers, I'll tell my wealthy churchgoers to cut off all SCM donations.
And the committee actually dispatched investigators into the streets to spy on their own missionary to make sure he wasn't secretly encouraging rich people to attend.
It exposes the raw financial possessiveness of the church at that time. Like in 1895, missionary Mills, the one who lost his son to the plague, was formally reprimanded for baptizing a baby.
Because the parents were destitute converts who refused to step foot in a grand church because they were ashamed of their ragged clothes. Mills baptized the baby so it wouldn't go unbaptized, and the committee punished him for usurping an ordained clergyman's revenue-generating role.
And they were attacked for conducting funerals, too. The official Church of England chaplain at Waverley Cemetery complained that SCM missionaries were illegally conducting burials.
12 funerals, to be exact.
That's right, for entirely destitute people with no church connections, or families who literally couldn't afford the official clergyman's mandatory fee. The missionaries were giving dignity to the dead, and the committee ordered them under threat of dismissal to never do it again.
The committee essentially wanted a corporate franchise. They viewed the SCM as a marketing funnel. Go down into the mud, do the dangerous work of converting the underclass, and then immediately draft them off into the pews of the traditional cathedrals.
But the customers felt totally alienated and judged in those fancy churches. They vastly preferred the authentic, compassionate missionaries who actually fed them.
And the clergy furiously resented the missionaries for earning that loyalty.
It is middle management bureaucracy applied to human souls. And it was worst in how they paid their staff. At the end of the 1890s, the cost of living in Sydney is rising. The missionaries humbly ask for a modest raise. The committee stalls for almost 2 full years.
Forming subcommittees, disbanding them, forming new ones.
It got so morally repugnant that one wealthy advocate on the committee, J.C. Taylor, calculated the difference in the salaries and paid the raise out of his own private bank account for 6 months. When the committee still refused, Taylor resigned in absolute disgust.
And when they finally did act, they gave a tiny raise to new agents, but actually reduced the salary of Michael Bowmaker, claiming a restructuring of funds, the guy who saved the starving child.
And we haven't even touched on the gender bias.
Yeah.
For years, the committee point blank refused to hire women as official agents to save money.
Even though volunteer women like Mrs. Sarah Aspinall were the only ones successfully holding street meetings in hyper-violent areas like Duran's Alley.
Yeah, the gang members would actually silence themselves out of respect for her. When they finally hired Bible women like Lucy Craven, who worked the brutal Woolloomooloo slums until she died on active duty at 85, they mathematically set the absolute maximum female salary at exactly half the minimum male rate.
Structurally, they were treated as expendable, low-cost labor by a board balancing ledgers. But this massive friction, the fact that poor converts couldn't integrate into middle-class churches, eventually forced the SCM into its next massive operational shift.
Right, because if you're converting hundreds of marginalized people, but they feel ashamed of their patched coats in a stone cathedral, you have a massive retention problem.
You have to give them a space where they belong.
Which launches the era of bricks and mortar, the rise of the mission halls.
Late 1800s to early 1900s, the strategy undergoes a monumental pivot. They realize standing on street corners isn't enough. They invest capital into building dedicated physical structures right in the epicenter of the worst slums: Chippendale, Paddington, Waterloo.
And these weren't traditional churches with high altars. They were vibrant community centers. They were built to aggressively compete with the pub.
Right, because if you think about urban geography back then, your apartment was a freezing room shared with 6 people. The pub was the center of warmth and social life.
So the mission halls provided cheap entertainment, well-lit reading rooms, musical concerts, and super popular physical culture classes like gymnastics and boxing.
The leadership finally recognized that to save a soul, you can't just hand them a book. You have to actively occupy the mind and the body. You have to provide healthy alternatives.
And very quickly, these massive halls became staging grounds for industrialized community welfare. During bitter winters, they became massive soup kitchens. They partnered with wealthy industrialists like this baker named William White.
And he didn't just drop off leftovers. He institutionalized it, donating 35,000 to 50,000 fresh loaves of bread annually.
Which is incredible scale.
And as the infrastructure grew, we see a sophisticated evolution in the psychology of their charity, especially around the holidays. Initially, they relied on wealthy donors to fund massive communal Christmas dinners.
Right, bring hundreds of people into a hall and feed them a feast.
Yes. Very generous, but also very performative. The poor had to line up and publicly perform their destitution for a handout. But in 1894, the SCM makes a radical shift. They stop the massive feasts and start distributing financial vouchers for groceries and meat directly to the families.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is a moment of profound psychological brilliance.
Yes.
because giving a family a voucher wasn't just distributing calories, it was preserving human dignity.
Exactly. It's the difference between forcing someone to wear a charity uniform versus giving them a budget to buy their own clothes.
No.
A voucher granted autonomy.
A family could walk into a butcher shop, pick their own roast, and cook it privately together. It maintained their self-respect. It's an incredibly modern concept of social work executed in the 1890s.
And it shows how deeply they were embedding into the community fabric. Look at missionary James Mathers at Miller's Point. He secures an abandoned Catholic church and launches free Sunday morning breakfasts for 300 destitute, unemployed men.
And he's creating a safe community structure. The records note that under Mathers, known burglars and chronic drunkards were turning into respectable citizens. He gave them a place to belong.
And securing those buildings requires immense capital. Enter the Ladies' Committee.
Oh, yes.
Middle-class and wealthy women excluded from the boardroom took control of fundraising. They ran massive fairs, taking over the Sydney Town Hall, selling crafts to convert the resources of the haves into liquid capital for the have-nots. In one fair in 1896, they raised over £1,200.
That's a massive percentage of their annual budget. And for you listening, I want you to think about how modern this sounds. The SCM was pioneering the third place. You have a disease-ridden room. You have work grueling, if you can get it. And the SCM steps in to provide that vital third place, a safe harbor for food and dignity.
But as the SCM grew in power, they stepped on some very powerful toes. Success inevitably breeds friction. They faced severe criticism from the secular press and rival religious institutions.
The press could be brutal. In 1904, the Truth newspaper ran a scathing headline accusing them of being a methodistical mission that cash and casuistically can't.
Wow.
Basically calling them a grift, saying they spent all the money on grand halls and staff salaries instead of giving it directly to the poor.
A critique almost every major charity still faces today. But that was mild compared to the bitter feud with the Roman Catholic Church, specifically Cardinal Moran.
And just a quick note for you listening, we are reporting this strictly as historical record. We aren't taking sides, we're just unpacking the political realities of early 20th century Sydney.
Right. So the tension exploded over street fundraising. The city council tried to force all charities to combine into one collection day. The SCM flatly refused, saying some charities had sectarian aims their Protestant donors couldn't support.
They demanded their own separate collection day.
This sparked absolute outrage. Cardinal Moran publicly attacked them in the press, accusing them of fraud. He claimed they used public funds to pay a gang of well-paid wowsers, a derogatory term for the missionaries, just to read Bibles.
While claiming Catholic priests worked for free, he basically called them an anti-Catholic lobbying group.
It was a massive PR crisis. But the SCM launched a modern, data-driven defense. They opened their accounting books to the public and proved their relief was entirely impartial.
Yeah, they published records showing they provided Christmas relief to 179 Catholic families alongside Protestants and atheists.
And what's historically fascinating is the psychological mechanism of the public response. Cardinal Moran intended to crush their funding, but it became the greatest marketing boon in their history.
Total backfire.
The newspaper coverage raised their profile immensely. When they finally held their separate collection day, donations nearly doubled. Citizens were dropping coins into SCM boxes saying, here's something for the cardinal and something for myself.
Even ordinary Catholics donated to them. It makes you ask, how does an organization stay focused on the poor when they're being used as a political football?
It takes immense operational discipline, but those sectarian squabbles were about to be completely dwarfed by global macroeconomic catastrophes that would rewrite Sydney.
The 20th century crucible. It begins with the Great Depression. The Australian economy is devastated. The mission halls are totally swamped, running massive daily food depots just to prevent mass starvation.
And as landlords evicted tenants, they converted halls into emergency overnight shelters. The missionaries were functioning purely as trauma medics.
But it was post-WWII that fundamentally altered their environment. The government initiated massive slum clearance programs. Entire blocks of 19th century housing were bulldozed.
And the traditional demographic the SCM served, the Anglo-Saxon working poor, were systematically relocated to newly built housing commission estates in the far western suburbs.
The human geography was radically hollowed out. The communities they spent decades building just vanished. And who replaced them? A massive influx of European migrants, Greeks, Maltese, Italians.
And this changes the sociological landscape completely. The migrants had different needs, language help, culture shock, navigating bureaucracy. And they often had stronger internal family networks.
They didn't necessarily need an SCM mission hall as a third place. They needed practical logistical help, like affordable childcare.
The mission struggled massively to adapt. You see deep institutional confusion. They moved their headquarters multiple times. In one breath, they're holding on to petty rivalries, refusing to lease a building to Seventh-day Adventists due to theological conflict.
But in the very next breath, they show incredible agility. When Chinese refugees flooded into Sydney fleeing the Japanese advance in WWII, the SCM immediately appointed an unpaid worker to help them.
A period defined by deep contradiction.
Because the ground shifted. The railways and cars are pushing populations outward. The localized walking distance mission hall model is dying. The existential crisis is glaring. If the slums are gone and the state is providing structural welfare, what is the purpose of the city mission?
And they faced ideological threats too. In 1949, and again, reporting impartially here, 5 members of the Communist Party visited the SCM superintendent and explicitly threatened physical violence if the SCM didn't stop giving relief.
The logic was terrifyingly pragmatic. The communists said the SCM's charity was successfully alleviating the misery of the working class, and that untreated misery was exactly the fuel they needed to spark a revolt.
By feeding the hungry, the SCM was actively pacifying the proletariat.
Just a stunning historical detail. Zooming out, the SCM in the 1950s reminds me of a blockbuster video store in the era of streaming. The core product, the need for care and crisis intervention, is still absolutely necessary because the government welfare state misses entire neighborhoods. But the delivery mechanism, the physical inner-city halls, is becoming obsolete. They have to reinvent how they deliver help or fade into history.
Which sets the stage for the aggressive modernization of the 1960s and 70s and the ultimate turning point, the Green Valley Project.
Enter Norman Reeve and Charles Chambers. They look at the changing landscape and declare the mission hall era dead. They push a radical agenda to transform the SCM from untrained evangelists into a highly professional social welfare agency with a team ministry.
Bringing in university-trained social workers, youth workers, family counselors. But you can't undertake a pivot that massive without detonating an internal earthquake.
The push for professionalization ignited a virtual civil war within the ranks. Veteran missionaries and conservative donors were furious. They thought the SCM was abandoning its 100-year-old founding mandate of evangelism to become a secular agency.
The tension boiled over. Management basically said, this is the new direction. Resign if you don't like it. And several did. But leadership pressed forward, and the high-stakes test case was Green Valley.
A massive, sprawling new housing commission area in the outer western suburbs where the relocated poor lived. The SCM followed them out west. But crucially, they didn't build a church or a traditional hall.
They built a massive, comprehensive, modern community center.
Addressing the complex social isolation of these brand new suburbs. They had youth centers to combat juvenile delinquency, judo classes, preschools for working moms, and professional financial counseling.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most critical question for any faith-based charity modernizing. How do you ultimately measure success? For a century, the board measured success by the number of souls professing salvation and Bibles distributed.
Right.
But in Green Valley, success was measured by volatile families stabilized, teenagers diverted from the justice system, isolated mothers finding support networks.
And this philosophical shift became official doctrine in 1974. They rewrote their core philosophy, making a declaration that would have given Benjamin Short a heart attack.
Oh, absolutely.
They declared that the professional welfare work is the actual demonstration of God's love. They instructed staff to help people strictly, regardless of whether they wanted Christian teaching. The aid was no longer a transactional hook. The aid itself was the gospel in action.
A beautiful theological evolution, but it faced real-world hurdles. In Green Valley, the SCM ran high-profile fundraising campaigns in the wealthy city centers to fund the center.
And the Green Valley residents resented it.
Deeply. They felt the marketing exaggerated their social problems and painted them as dystopian charity cases just to extract donations from rich executives. They wanted the center, but proudly rejected the stigma of being a pity project.
So what does this all mean? Did the mission lose its soul to stay relevant, or did it finally realize what its soul actually was? The history heavily suggests the latter, because this professional approach equipped them to tackle the complex, deadly crises of the late 20th century.
Crises Benjamin Short couldn't have conceptualized.
Like their revolutionary approach to alcoholism. For decades, they treated it as a moral failing to be preached away. But guided by modern professionals, they shifted to treating it as a complex medical and psychological illness.
The scale of intervention becomes industrial. They take over the old city night refuge, which was basically a depressing flophouse, sell the property, and use the capital to build Campbell House,
A state-of-the-art, medically supervised rehabilitation center with a hospital wing, a dignified hostel, and a sheltered workshop.
and they opened Swanton Lodge for the hardcore, chronic, unrepentant alcoholics and drug addicts, too disruptive for standard rehab.
But building and staffing advanced medical facilities requires capital that volunteer bake sales just can't generate.
Exactly. And this forces the final massive ideological pivot. After 100 years of fiercely refusing to take a single penny of government money to maintain religious independence, the scale requires them to capitulate. They begin accepting massive state and federal grants.
Like a staggering $700,000 government grant just for Swanton Lodge.
It's a total paradigm shift. They become partners with the secular state.
And that capital enables incredible innovations. Look at 1980. The state government repealed the Summary Offenses Act, meaning police were no longer allowed to arrest people simply for public intoxication.
So police stopped picking up drunks overnight. Deeply intoxicated, homeless people were just being left in the gutters, vulnerable to exposure and death.
In immediate response, the SCM launches Mission Beat, a fleet of specially equipped, radio-dispatched, 24-hour street patrol vans. They drive the darkest streets, picking up over 2,000 intoxicated or critically homeless people every single month.
They are performing frontline medical rescue operations. And they complement this with psychological rescue. They realize modern poverty isn't always visible. So they launch Start Over, a professional telephone counseling service partnering with radio station 2UW.
Reaching the hidden, isolated poor, suffering from addiction or suicidal ideation behind suburban doors. This highlights a crucial sociological point. Absolute poverty like starving in a loft in the 1860s is rare in 1980s Australia due to the welfare state. But the fragmentation of communities creates deep psychological poverty.
The core human need hasn't vanished, it just mutated. And the SCM mutated to meet it.
Yeah.
The book has this moving scene describing an Easter Sunday service at Swanton Lodge. You look around and you see deeply scarred, self-conscious men whose bodies and minds have been ravaged by addiction.
And they're finding a moment of genuine dignity, safety, and community over a simple meal of tea and sandwiches. It's profound transformative care.
And as they modernize their care, they modernize their political tactics. There's a brilliant story from 1980. The state government was bureaucratically delaying the operational funding for the Mission Beat vans.
Right.
So the SCM, this formerly quiet charity, literally drove the vans into the middle of Sydney Square, parked them, and went on a highly publicized strike. They used media pressure to force the government's hand to release the funds.
Brilliant advocacy. It's an incredible organizational journey. Think about the arc. They started with earnest, underpaid men getting pelted with stones in Duran's Alley, trying to shove paper Bibles at starving people. And 125 years later, they're running radio-dispatched medical rescue vans, managing commercial real estate, and operating state-of-the-art hospitals.
The ultimate testament to the necessity of institutional adaptation.
And that brings us to the end of this deep dive. We've tracked an organization through 125 years of grueling history. We've seen how the harsh physical reality of human suffering forced a rigid committee to become deeply practical.
They learned that dogmatism cannot cure physical disease, and abstract theology cannot fill an empty stomach.
Exactly. And for you listening right now, the takeaway is highly actionable. Whether you run a business, direct a nonprofit, or manage your career, this proves that to actually survive over the long haul, you cannot rigidly hold on to original methods or boardroom theories. You have to constantly look at the ground truth. You have to adapt to the messy, changing needs of the people in front of you, even if it means tearing up your original plan.
But I want to leave you with a final lingering thought. A provocative, structural question building on that massive pivot in the 1970s. Think deeply about the long-term implications for a fiercely independent, faith-based charity when it essentially becomes a contracted service delivery mechanism for the secular state. Does that heavy reliance on government funding, with all its associated rules and secular audits, inevitably force a voluntary charity to compromise its founding ideals and lose its unique soul? Or, by giving the charity the massive resources required to save thousands of lives instead of dozens, is becoming a formalized partner to the state actually the ultimate triumphant fulfillment of its mission to serve at scale? It's a complex tension that every major nonprofit leader navigates today, and it's something fascinating for you to mull over.
A profound, incredibly relevant question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive journey through the historical streets of Sydney. We love unpacking these complex organizational histories with you. Until next time, keep diving deep.